I found the manila folder wedged behind the water heater in my garage, covered in dust and spider webs, and I almost threw it away without looking inside. My name is Marcus Chen, and I had just moved into my house in Scottsdale, Arizona 3 months earlier. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Clarkson, had passed away shortly before closing, and her family seemed desperate to sell the property quickly. I assumed the folder was just old utility bills or warranties for appliances that no longer existed. But when I opened it that Saturday afternoon in late September, I discovered something that would turn my quiet suburban neighborhood into a media circus. The folder contained meeting minutes from the Saguaro Springs Homeowners Association, dating back 5 years. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed Dorothy's name appearing repeatedly, highlighted in yellow marker. The first few mentions were routine violations for things like her mailbox needing paint and a crack in her driveway. But as I continued reading, the tone shifted dramatically. The minutes from a meeting 3 years ago contained a motion, seconded and unanimously approved by the board to pursue all available legal remedies to ensure compliance and recover fees from the Clarkson property. I sat down on my garage floor, reading more carefully now. The next set of minutes detailed how Dorothy had fallen behind on HOA fees after her husband died. She owed approximately $2,000, but instead of working with her, the board had voted to hire a law firm. The legal fees quickly ballooned. Within 6 months, Dorothy owed $15,000. Within a year, it was $30,000. And then I found the minutes that made my stomach turn. The meeting had taken place on March 15th, 2 years ago. The board president, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, had made a motion to initiate foreclosure proceedings against 4782 Desert Bloom Lane to recover outstanding debts owed to the association. The property address was my house, Dorothy's house. The vote was recorded as 4 in favor, 0 against, with 1 abstention. But what caught my eye was a handwritten note in the margin, in what appeared to be Dorothy's shaky handwriting. "They are doing this on purpose. They want my house." I spent the rest of that Saturday reading every document in the folder. There were copies of letters from the HOA's attorney, each one more threatening than the last. There were payment plans that Dorothy had apparently tried to negotiate, all rejected by the board. There were medical bills showing that Dorothy had been undergoing cancer treatment during this entire ordeal. And there was a final letter, dated just 4 months before her death, informing her that the HOA had placed a lien on her property and would proceed with foreclosure if the debt was not satisfied immediately. The debt at that point had reached $53,000 for an initial $2,000 fee. I called my sister Rachel that evening. She was an investigative journalist for the Phoenix Chronicle, and I knew she would understand the significance of what I had found. When I told her about the documents, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, are you absolutely certain about what you are reading?" she asked. "Because if this is real, this is a major story." "I am looking at the minutes right now," I said. "They voted to bankrupt this woman." "It is all written down, dated with signatures from the board members." "Do not touch those documents anymore," Rachel said. "I am coming over right now." "And Marcus, do not talk to anyone in your HOA about this. Not yet." Rachel arrived 45 minutes later with her laptop and a scanner. We spent the next 3 hours scanning every page in the folder, creating digital backups. As we worked, Rachel explained what she was seeing from a legal perspective. "This is elder abuse," she said, her voice tight with anger, "and it might be fraud. HOAs have the legal right to collect fees and even foreclose on properties, but there are limits. They are supposed to act reasonably. Turning a $2,000 debt into a foreclosure case is unconscionable." "Can they actually do that?" I asked. Just vote to destroy someone's life. Technically, they followed the legal process, Rachel said, but that does not make it ethical. And if we can show that they deliberately inflated the debt or targeted Dorothy specifically, we might have evidence of a conspiracy. The fact that they documented their votes makes it even worse. They were not trying to hide it because they did not think anyone would care. We finished scanning around 11 that night. Rachel packed up her equipment and looked at me seriously. "I need to make some calls tomorrow," she said. "I am going to reach out to some sources, maybe talk to a few legal experts. But Marcus, I want to run this as a story. This is exactly the kind of investigative piece the Chronicle should be covering. Are you okay with that?" I thought about Dorothy, dying in a hospital room, knowing that the home she had shared with her husband for 30 years was being taken from her. I thought about her family, probably unaware of the full extent of what the HOA had done. And I thought about Patricia Hendricks and the other board members, sitting in their comfortable homes, probably congratulating themselves on their fiscal responsibility. "Run the story," I said. The next morning, I decided I needed to know more about Dorothy. The documents told me what the HOA had done to her, but I wanted to understand who she had been. I started by talking to my next-door neighbor, an older man named Gerald who had lived in Saguaro Springs for over a decade. I found Gerald washing his car in his driveway. When I asked him about Dorothy, his face fell. "Dorothy Clarkson was one of the kindest people I have ever known," he said, setting down his sponge. "After her husband Bill passed, she kind of retreated into herself. She was dealing with a lot, medical issues, financial problems. The HOA did not make it any easier." "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "They went after her," Gerald said bluntly. "Patricia Hendricks had it out for Dorothy for some reason, started nitpicking every little thing. Dorothy's grass was a quarter-inch too long. Her trash cans were visible from the street for 30 minutes past the pickup time. It was harassment, plain and simple. And when Dorothy could not keep up with the fines, they came after her house." "Did anyone try to help her?" I asked. Gerald looked uncomfortable. "Some of us tried. I offered to loan her money, but she was too proud to accept it. Another neighbor, Susan Martinez, tried to attend an HOA meeting to speak on Dorothy's behalf, but Patricia shut her down. Said it was not open for discussion. By the time we realized how bad it had gotten, the legal process was already underway." "Why did Patricia target her?" I asked. Gerald hesitated. "There was bad blood between them. Years ago, Dorothy had opposed Patricia when she first ran for the HOA board. Dorothy thought Patricia was too controlling, too aggressive. Patricia won anyway, and I think she held a grudge. When Dorothy became vulnerable, Patricia saw an opportunity." I thanked Gerald for his time and walked back to my house, my mind racing. This was not just about money or rules. It was personal. Patricia had used the HOA as a weapon to settle a personal vendetta. Rachel called me that afternoon. "I have been making calls all morning," she said. "I spoke with 3 different attorneys who specialize in HOA law. They all said the same thing. What happened to Dorothy was legal, but it was also deeply unethical. One of them used the word predatory. I also reached out to Dorothy's family. Her daughter, Karen Clarkson, lives in Tucson. She wants to talk." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "Just that we found some documents related to her mother's property." I did not give her details over the phone. "But Marcus," she started crying. She said she always suspected something was wrong but did not have proof. She is driving up here tomorrow. That night, I did something I probably should not have done. I walked over to Patricia Hendricks' house. I had seen her around the neighborhood a few times, always impeccably dressed, always with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Her house was the largest on the block, a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa with perfectly manicured landscaping. I rang the doorbell. Patricia answered, looking surprised to see me. She was probably in her mid-50s, with highlighted blonde hair and too much makeup. She wore white capri pants and a pink polo shirt with the Sagaro Springs HOA logo embroidered on the chest. "Marcus, right?" she said. "What can I do for you?" I wanted to introduce myself properly, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. I have been meaning to get more involved in the community. I was wondering if I could learn more about the HOA. Patricia's face lit up. "Of course, we always need more engaged homeowners. Come in, come in." Her house was exactly what I expected. Everything was white and pristine, with motivational signs on the walls saying things like live, laugh, love, and blessed. She led me to her kitchen and poured 2 glasses of lemonade without asking if I wanted any. "So, you bought the Clarkson property," Patricia said, sitting across from me at her kitchen island. "That was such a sad situation." "What happened?" I asked, feigning ignorance. Patricia sighed dramatically. "Dorothy was a lovely woman, but she really let the property decline after her husband died. We tried to work with her, we really did, but she just would not comply with the community standards. Eventually, we had no choice but to take legal action. It was not personal, it was about protecting property values for everyone." I took a sip of lemonade to avoid saying what I was thinking. "That must have been difficult for everyone involved." "It was," Patricia said. "But as HOA president, I have to make tough decisions. Not everyone understands that. Some people think I am too strict, but I am just trying to maintain the character of our neighborhood. Do you know how much time I volunteer? Probably 20 hours a week. And do I get any appreciation? No, I get complaints and criticism." She continued talking, mostly about herself, for another 20 minutes. I learned that she had been HOA president for 6 years, that she had previously served on the board of her children's private school, and that she considered herself a community leader. She never mentioned Dorothy again, and I did not bring it up. As I left, Patricia handed me a thick binder containing all the HOA rules and regulations. "Read this carefully," she said. "We have standards here, and we expect all homeowners to follow them. I would hate for you to end up in the same situation as Dorothy." The threat was thinly veiled, but it was there. I walked home feeling sick. Karen Clarkson arrived at my house the next afternoon. She was in her early 40s, with her mother's kind eyes and a tired expression that suggested she had not slept well in a long time. Rachel was already there, setting up her laptop on my dining room table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Rachel said gently. "I know this must be difficult." Karen sat down heavily. "My mother died 4 months ago, pancreatic cancer. She spent the last 6 months of her life fighting the HOA instead of focusing on her health. I was so angry, but I did not know what to do. After she died, we had to sell the house quickly because of the lien. We barely got anything after the HOA and their lawyers took their cut." "How much did they take?" I asked. "Almost $60,000, Karen said, her voice breaking. "For an initial debt of $2,000, my mother was a retired teacher. She and my father had paid off that house completely. It was supposed to be her security. Instead, it killed her." Rachel slid a box of tissues across the table. "Karen, we found some documents, meeting minutes from the HOA board. They show that the board voted deliberately to pursue foreclosure against your mother. We think this might be more than just aggressive collection tactics. This might be intentional." I brought out the folder and showed Karen the highlighted pages. She read through them, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew Patricia Hendricks was behind this. My mother told me that Patricia hated her, but I thought she was just being paranoid. Oh God, she was right. They voted to destroy her." "Did your mother ever explain why Patricia hated her?" Rachel asked, her fingers poised over her laptop keyboard. Karen nodded. Years ago, before my father died, there was a vote to increase HOA fees to build a fancy new community center. My mother opposed it. She thought the money should go to maintaining the existing facilities and helping homeowners who were struggling. Patricia was pushing hard for the new center. My mother spoke at a meeting and convinced enough people to vote against it. Patricia never forgave her. After my father died and my mother got sick, Patricia saw her chance for revenge. Rachel typed quickly. "Would you be willing to go on record with this, for a news story?" Karen did not hesitate. "Yes, absolutely. If it means exposing what they did to my mother, I will tell anyone who will listen." We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. Rachel interviewed Karen, recording audio and taking detailed notes. Karen provided photos of Dorothy, medical records showing her cancer treatment timeline, and bank statements showing how the fees had escalated. By the end, we had built a comprehensive timeline of Dorothy's last years, with the HOA's actions documented at every step. "This is going to be big," Rachel said after Karen left. "I am going to write this up tonight and present it to my editor tomorrow. If he greenlights it, this could run as early as Wednesday." "What do you think will happen?" I asked. "Best case scenario." "Public outrage and investigation into the HOA's practices, maybe some legal consequences for the board members," Rachel said. "Worst case, nothing. People read it, get angry for a day, and then forget about it. But either way, Dorothy's story deserves to be told." I spent the next 2 days in a state of nervous anticipation. I went to work at my job as a software engineer, but I could barely focus. I kept thinking about Dorothy, about Karen's tears, about Patricia's fake smile. On Tuesday evening, Rachel called. "It is running tomorrow," she said. "Front page above the fold. My editor loved it. He is calling it one of the most important pieces of investigative journalism we have done all year." "Marcus, are you ready for this? Because once this story goes live, things are going to get crazy." "I am ready," I said. The story published Wednesday morning with the headline, "HOA Board Voted to Bankrupt Dying Widow, Meeting Minutes Reveal." Rachel had done an incredible job. The article laid out everything. Dorothy's initial debt, the escalating fees, the board's votes, Patricia's vendetta, and Karen's testimony. The scanned meeting minutes were included as images, showing the actual votes. The story ended with a powerful quote from Karen. "They did not just take my mother's house. They took her peace in her final days. No one should have to die fighting their own neighbors." My phone started ringing at 6 in the morning. Local news stations wanted interviews. Other newspapers wanted to follow up. By 8, there were 3 news vans parked on my street. By 9, Patricia Hendricks was standing on my front porch, pounding on my door. I looked through the peephole. Patricia's face was red, her carefully styled hair disheveled. Behind her, I could see a camera crew filming from the street. "Marcus Chen, I know you are in there." She shouted, "You had no right to take those documents. Those are private HOA records. I am calling the police." I opened the door and Patricia nearly fell forward. The camera crew rushed closer. "Those documents were left in my house by the previous owner," I said calmly, very aware that we were being filmed. "They are not HOA property. They are Dorothy Clarkson's personal records." "You are going to regret this," Patricia hissed. "I will make sure you regret this. You think Dorothy had problems with the HOA? Just wait." "Are you threatening me, Miss Hendricks?" I asked. "On camera." Patricia seemed to realize where she was and who was watching. She straightened up, smoothed her hair, and forced a smile. "Of course not. I am simply informing you that there will be legal consequences for violating HOA privacy. Our attorney will be in touch." She turned and walked toward the news crew, her demeanor completely changed. "I am happy to make a statement," she said brightly. "The board takes these allegations very seriously, but I want to be clear that everything we did was completely legal and within our authority." We have a responsibility to all homeowners to maintain standards and collect fees. Miss Clarkson, rest her soul, refused to work with us despite numerous opportunities to resolve her debt. I watched from my doorway as Patricia spun the story, portraying herself and the board as victims of a smear campaign. But the reporters were not buying it. One of them, a young woman from the local ABC affiliate, held up a printout of the meeting minutes. Miss Hendricks, these minutes show that the board voted to pursue foreclosure when Miss Clarkson owed only $2,000. Why not accept one of her payment plan proposals instead? Patricia's smile tightened. Those payment plans were not realistic. We have fiduciary duties to the association. The documents show you rejected a plan where she would pay $200 per month, the reporter continued. That would have paid off the debt in 10 months. Instead, you hired lawyers whose fees eventually totaled over $50,000. How is that fiscally responsible? Patricia's composure cracked. I am not going to stand here and be ambushed. If you want a formal statement, contact our attorney. She stormed off toward her house. The reporters then turned to me. I spent the next hour giving interviews, explaining how I found the documents and what they revealed. I was careful to stick to facts and let the documents speak for themselves. By noon, the story was everywhere. Local television stations ran it as their lead story. National news outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with outrage. That afternoon, I received a call from someone identifying himself as Detective Robert Morrison with the Scottsdale Police Department. He asked if I could come to the station to provide a statement. Am I in trouble? I asked. No, sir, Detective Morrison said. We are opening an investigation into potential elder abuse and fraud related to the Sagaro Springs HOA. You are a witness, not a suspect. I drove to the police station, bringing copies of all the documents. Detective Morrison was a man in his 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude. He sat me down in an interview room and asked me to walk through everything from the beginning. The county prosecutor saw the news story this morning, he explained. She immediately flagged it for investigation. Elder financial abuse is a serious crime in Arizona, and if the HOA board knowingly targeted Miss Clarkson because of her age and vulnerability, they could face criminal charges. How does this work? I asked. We are going to subpoena all the HOA's records, interview board members, and reconstruct exactly what happened, Detective Morrison said. The meeting minutes you found are crucial evidence. They show premeditation. The board did not just stumble into this situation. They voted on it. They made deliberate decisions. That could rise to the level of criminal conspiracy. Over the next few days, the story continued to grow. More neighbors came forward with their own stories of HOA abuse. Gerald told reporters how the HOA had fined him $500 for parking his car on the street overnight when his garage door broke. Susan Martinez described being threatened with legal action because her rose bushes were the wrong shade of pink. Another homeowner, David Chen, no relation to me, revealed that he had been fined $2,000 for installing solar panels without HOA approval, even though Arizona state law explicitly allows solar panels. The common thread in all these stories was Patricia Hendricks. She had ruled the Sagaro Springs HOA like a personal fiefdom for 6 years, and anyone who crossed her faced retaliation. But Dorothy's case was the worst because it had ended in her death and the loss of her home. On Friday, 5 days after Rachel's story published, the Arizona Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation into the Sagaro Springs HOA. That same day, 3 of the 5 board members resigned. Patricia Hendricks was not one of them. Instead, Patricia called an emergency HOA meeting for Saturday evening. According to Arizona law, HOA meetings had to be open to all homeowners, so I decided to attend. Rachel came with me, along with Karen Clarkson, who had driven up from Tucson specifically for the meeting. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest building near the neighborhood entrance. When we arrived, the parking lot was packed. Inside, every seat was filled with people standing along the walls. News cameras lined the back of the room. The atmosphere was tense. Patricia sat at a table at the front of the room, flanked by the two remaining board members. A nervous-looking man named Frank Morrison, and a woman named Deborah Walsh who kept glancing at the exit. Patricia was wearing a navy blue suit, and her expression was defiant. She called the meeting to order by banging a gavel, which struck me as absurdly dramatic given the circumstances. "This meeting will proceed according to proper procedures," Patricia announced. "We will not entertain any disruptions or personal attacks. The board has prepared a statement regarding recent media coverage." "You do not get to control this meeting anymore, Patricia," someone shouted from the audience. I recognized Gerald's voice. Patricia ignored him and began reading from a prepared statement. "The board of the Saguaro Springs Homeowners Association stands by its actions regarding the Clarkson property. While we sympathize with Miss Clarkson's health issues, the board has a legal obligation to collect fees and enforce community standards. All actions taken were approved by the HOA's attorney and were in full compliance with Arizona law. You voted to bankrupt a dying woman," another voice called out. Patricia continued reading. "Furthermore, the unauthorized disclosure of private HOA meeting minutes represents a serious breach of confidentiality. The board is exploring legal action against the individuals responsible." I stood up. Those minutes were not private. They were public records under Arizona law. HOA meeting minutes must be made available to homeowners. "You just never thought anyone would actually read them." Patricia glared at me. "You are out of order, Mr. Chen." "No, you are out of order," I said. "You abused your authority. You turned a $2,000 debt into a $53,000 nightmare. You foreclosed on a woman's home while she was dying of cancer, and you did it because of a personal grudge." The room erupted in applause. Patricia banged her gavel repeatedly, but no one paid attention. Karen Clarkson stood up next. "My mother was a good person. She taught second grade for 30 years. She volunteered at the food bank. She never hurt anyone, and you killed her. Maybe not directly, but the stress you put her through in her final months absolutely contributed to her death. I want everyone in this room to know that." Patricia's face was white. "I did not kill anyone. Your mother died of cancer." "You made her final days hell," Karen said, her voice shaking. "She could not sleep because she was worried about losing her home. She could not focus on treatment because she was dealing with your lawyers. She died afraid and anxious, and that is on you." Deborah Walsh suddenly stood up. "I am resigning from the board, effective immediately." She grabbed her purse and walked out. Frank Morrison looked like he wanted to follow her but remained seated. Patricia tried to regain control. "We still have a quorum. The meeting will continue." "No, it will not," the voice came from the back of the room. A tall man in a dark suit walked forward, holding a badge. "I am Detective Robert Morrison with the Scottsdale Police. Miss Hendricks, I need you to come with me for questioning regarding criminal elder abuse charges." The room went silent. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "Am I under arrest?" She finally managed to ask. "Not at this time," Detective Morrison said, "but we have some questions and I strongly suggest you cooperate. Mr. Morrison, Miss Walsh, you should come as well." Frank Morrison stood up so quickly he knocked over his chair. "I voted against the foreclosure. It is in the minutes. I abstained. I did not want any part of it." "We will take your statement," Detective Morrison said. "Let's go." As Patricia walked out, flanked by police, the room erupted in chaos. People were shouting, crying, and hugging each other. News cameras swarmed. Rachel was furiously typing on her phone, filing an update to her story. I found myself standing next to Karen. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for caring enough to look at those papers. Thank you for not just throwing them away." "Your mother deserved better," I said. "Yes, she did." The following week brought more developments. The Attorney General's investigation expanded to include other HOAs across Arizona following a flood of complaints. Detective Morrison's investigation led to the discovery that Patricia had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including a vacation to Hawaii that she had claimed was an HOA conference. She had also given the HOA's legal work to her brother-in-law's law firm, which had billed excessive hours and inflated fees, with Patricia receiving kickbacks. On Thursday, exactly 1 week after the emergency HOA meeting, Patricia Hendricks was arrested and charged with elder abuse, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Frank Morrison was charged as an accessory. Deborah Walsh, who had resigned and cooperated with investigators, was not charged but faced civil lawsuits. The other 2 board members who had resigned earlier were also under investigation. The story went national. Rachel's original article was picked up by the Associated Press and ran in newspapers across the country. She was invited to appear on several national news programs to discuss the story. The case became a focal point for discussions about HOA reform and elder abuse prevention. I testified before the Arizona State Legislature in November, supporting a bill that would limit HOA foreclosure powers and require mandatory mediation before legal action. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law by the governor in December. It became known as Dorothy's Law. Patricia's trial began in February. I attended several days of testimony. The prosecution presented the HOA meeting minutes, financial records showing the embezzlement, emails between Patricia and the law firm discussing how to maximize fees, and testimony from Dorothy's doctors about how stress had worsened her condition. Karen Clarkson gave a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears. Patricia's defense was that she had only been doing her job as HOA president and that all her actions had been legal. Her attorney argued that the embezzlement charges were based on misunderstandings and that the Hawaii trip had legitimate business purposes. The jury did not buy it. On March 10th, Patricia Hendricks was convicted on all counts. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $120,000 to the HOA and to Karen Clarkson. Frank Morrison received 3 years probation and community service. The civil lawsuits against all the board members resulted in additional financial judgments. The Saguaro Springs HOA was placed under court-supervised management while new elections were organized. Gerald ran for the board and won. He immediately implemented reforms, including transparency measures, fee caps, and a hardship assistance program. The community that had been torn apart by Patricia's reign slowly began to heal. Rachel won a regional journalism award for her coverage of the story. She continued to investigate HOA abuses across Arizona, uncovering several other cases of elder financial exploitation. Her work led to additional reforms and criminal prosecutions. As for me, I became unexpectedly involved in HOA reform advocacy. I spoke at community events, worked with legislators, and helped other homeowners navigate disputes with their HOAs. It was not something I had ever planned to do, but finding those meeting minutes in my garage had changed my life's direction. On what would have been Dorothy's 73rd birthday, Karen and I planted a tree in the small park at the center of Saguaro Springs. We placed a plaque at its base that read, "In memory of Dorothy Clarkson, a beloved teacher, neighbor, and friend. May we always remember to show kindness to those who need it most." The tree was a desert willow, known for its resilience and beautiful flowers. It seemed fitting. Dorothy had been resilient too, fighting until the end against people who should have been her neighbors and protectors. She had lost that fight, but her story had sparked a movement that would protect countless others. I often thought about that Saturday afternoon, when I almost threw away the folder without looking inside. If I had, Patricia would still be HOA president, probably tormenting some other vulnerable homeowner. The meeting minutes would have been lost forever. Dorothy's story would have died with her. But I had looked, and that simple act of curiosity had exposed a conspiracy, brought criminals to justice, changed state law, and given Karen some measure of peace. It reminded me that ordinary people have more power than we think. Sometimes all it takes is paying attention and refusing to stay silent when we witness injustice. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does. The news vans left. The reporters moved on to other stories. Life in Saguaro Springs returned to something resembling normal, though it would never be quite the same. There was a wariness now, an understanding that the people we elect to positions of power, even small local positions like HOA boards, can abuse that power if we are not vigilant. I kept the original folder, stored safely in a fireproof box. Rachel had the scans, and copies had been submitted to the court, so the originals were not strictly necessary anymore. But I felt like I was holding them in trust for Dorothy. They were evidence that her suffering had not been ignored, that her story had mattered. One evening in April, about 7 months after I first found the documents, I was working in my front yard when an older couple stopped to talk to me. They introduced themselves as Bill and Margaret Foster from 2 streets over. "We wanted to thank you," Margaret said. "Our son has special needs and lives with us. Last year, the HOA fined us because his therapy equipment was visible through our garage window. Patricia said it was unsightly and violated community standards. We were terrified we would end up like Dorothy. But now, with the new board, they rescinded the fine and apologized. You gave us our peace of mind back." Stories like that made everything worthwhile. The harassment I had faced from Patricia's supporters, the threatening letters from her attorney, the uncomfortable scrutiny that came with being at the center of a major news story, all of it faded in importance compared to knowing that real change had occurred. The legal reforms sparked by Dorothy's case spread beyond Arizona. Other states began examining their HOA laws and implementing similar protections. A national organization formed to advocate for homeowner rights and HOA accountability. Rachel served on its advisory board. They asked me to join too, and I accepted. I learned that HOA abuse was far more common than most people realized. Across the country, thousands of homeowners were trapped in situations similar to Dorothy's, facing aggressive boards, escalating fees, and the threat of foreclosure over minor violations. The power structure of HOAs made abuse almost inevitable. Volunteer boards with minimal oversight, authority to levy fines and fees, and the ability to foreclose on properties. It was a system ripe for exploitation, especially when personality types like Patricia got involved. Patricia's case became a teaching example in law schools, discussed in classes on property law and elder abuse. Journalists studied Rachel's coverage as an example of effective investigative reporting. And advocates pointed to Dorothy's law as proof that grassroots activism could create meaningful change. Karen and I stayed in touch. She told me that finally knowing the full truth about what happened to her mother had brought her closure. The financial restitution helped too, though no amount of money could compensate for Dorothy's suffering. Karen used part of the money to establish a scholarship at Dorothy's former school for students planning to become teachers. It was what Dorothy would have wanted. On the one-year anniversary of Rachel's story publishing, the Phoenix Chronicle ran a follow-up piece examining the impact of the coverage and the subsequent reforms. The article included interviews with homeowners whose lives had been changed by the new laws, statistics on HOA foreclosures before and after the reforms, and an update on Patricia's imprisonment. The headline was, "How One Folder of Documents Changed Arizona HOA Law." Reading that article, I felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in what we had accomplished, sadness that it took Dorothy's death to spark change, anger that the system had allowed someone like Patricia to abuse her power for so long, and hope that maybe, just maybe, Dorothy's suffering had not been completely in vain. I thought about all the small decisions that had led to this outcome. Dorothy's decision to keep copies of the HOA minutes, her daughter's decision to trust us with her mother's story, Rachel's decision to pursue the story despite knowing it might be controversial, my decision to open that dusty folder instead of tossing it in the trash. Each small choice had mattered. The desert willow tree we had planted grew quickly in the Arizona sun. By the anniversary, it was already several feet tall, with delicate purple flowers blooming on its branches. Children played near it without knowing its significance. Neighbors walked past it on evening strolls. It was becoming part of the landscape, a living memorial to a woman most of them had never known. I sometimes wondered what Dorothy would think of everything that had happened. Would she be pleased that her story had sparked reforms? Would she be satisfied that Patricia had gone to prison? Or would she simply wish that none of it had been necessary, that she had been allowed to live out her final years in peace in the home she loved? I like to think she would be grateful that someone had cared enough to tell her story, that she had not been forgotten, that her suffering had meaning beyond her own experience. The new Saguaro Springs HOA board operated with a transparency that would have been unthinkable under Patricia's leadership. They posted meeting minutes online within 48 hours. They created a website where homeowners could track all fees and violations. They established an ombudsman position to help residents navigate disputes. And most importantly, they treated homeowners with respect and compassion. It should not have been revolutionary, but in the world of HOAs, it was. Other communities started reaching out, asking how Saguaro Springs had transformed its governance. Gerald and the new board members became unlikely ambassadors for HOA reform, speaking at conferences and workshops. They always made sure to center Dorothy's story, to remind people why the reforms mattered. I continued living in Dorothy's house, though I always thought of it that way rather than as mine. I took excellent care of it, not because I feared HOA violations, but because it felt like honoring her memory. I kept the garden she had planted. I maintained the paint colors she had chosen. I made sure it remained a home she would recognize. Sometimes late at night, when the desert air finally cooled and the stars were bright overhead, I would sit on my back patio and think about the invisible threads that connect us all. How Dorothy's life had touched mine across time and death. How a folder of papers had revealed truths that powerful people wanted hidden. How ordinary citizens, armed with nothing but facts and determination, had taken on an entrenched system and won. It was a story about justice, but also about something deeper. About the responsibility we have to each other, especially to the most vulnerable among us. About the importance of documentation and transparency in systems of power. About the courage it takes to speak up when it would be easier to stay silent. Rachel's career flourished after her coverage of the HOA story. She moved to a larger paper in Washington, D.C., where she continued doing investigative journalism on issues affecting ordinary Americans. But she told me that the Dorothy Clarkson story remained the one she was most proud of. It was local journalism at its best, she said, holding powerful institutions accountable and creating real change in people's lives. The legal proceedings against the law firm that had represented the HOA took longer to resolve. The firm's managing partner eventually admitted to charging excessive fees and agreed to a settlement that included disbarment for 2 of the attorneys involved. The Arizona State Bar implemented new guidelines for HOA legal work, requiring detailed fee justifications and prohibiting certain predatory practices. As spring turned to summer and then fall again, life in Saguaro Springs settled into a new rhythm. The neighborhood was quieter now, less tense. People actually talked to their neighbors instead of worrying about being reported for violations. Kids rode bikes in the streets. Block parties were organized. It began to feel like a real community instead of a collection of people living in fear of their HOA board. I received occasional messages from homeowners in other states facing similar situations. They had read about Dorothy's case and wanted advice. I helped when I could, connecting them with lawyers, journalists, and advocacy organizations. Each story was unique, but the patterns were familiar. Power-hungry board members, escalating fees, vulnerable homeowners, and a legal system that enabled abuse. Not all of those stories had happy endings. Some homeowners lost their properties despite fighting back. Some journalists could not convince their editors to run the stories. Some prosecutors declined to file charges even when the evidence seemed clear. Dorothy's case had succeeded in part because of fortunate timing, compelling documentation, and dedicated people willing to pursue justice. Not everyone was so lucky. But even the stories that did not end in prosecution or reform served a purpose. They added to the growing body of evidence that HOA abuse was a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions. They kept the issue in the public consciousness. They encouraged more people to speak up and more journalists to investigate. In November, I was invited to speak at a national conference on property rights. I stood at a podium in front of several hundred people and told Dorothy's story. I showed slides of the meeting minutes, explaining how each vote had pushed her closer to losing her home. I described finding the folder in my garage and making the decision to bring it to light. And I talked about the importance of ordinary citizens refusing to accept injustice, even when powerful institutions insist everything is legal and proper. Dorothy Clarkson was not a crusader or an activist, I said. She was a retired teacher who wanted to live quietly in her home. She should not have had to fight. She should not have had to become a symbol. But because she did suffer, and because she documented what happened to her, we have been able to create change that will protect thousands of other homeowners. That is her legacy. And it is our responsibility to honor it by remaining vigilant against abuses of power, no matter how small or local they seem. The speech was well received. Afterward, dozens of people came up to share their own HOA horror stories or thank me for speaking out. A few board members from well-run HOAs told me that the publicity around Dorothy's case had helped them push through reforms in their own communities. The case had become a rallying cry. We do not want to be like Patricia Hendricks. We do not want to be like the Saguaro Springs HOA. As Christmas approached, I put up lights on my house for the first time. Under the old regime, there had been strict rules about holiday decorations, including approved colors and installation dates. The new board had simplified the rules to one principle: be tasteful and respectful of neighbors. I strung white lights along the roofline and wrapped them around the desert willow tree. It looked beautiful. On Christmas Eve, I attended a neighborhood party at Gerald's house. Most of the block was there, including several people who had testified against Patricia at trial. We drank eggnog, exchanged small gifts, and marveled at how different life felt compared to a year earlier. Someone proposed a toast to Dorothy, and we all raised our glasses to a woman most of us had never met but who had changed all our lives. Karen drove up from Tucson to join us. She had been hesitant at first, worried about returning to the neighborhood where her mother had suffered so much. But she was glad she came. People shared memories of Dorothy, small kindnesses she had shown them over the years. A picture emerged of a woman who had been deeply woven into the community, someone whose loss had been felt even if it had not been properly acknowledged at the time. She would have loved this, Karen said, looking around at the gathering. She always believed in the power of neighbors looking out for each other. She just ran into a board that did not share those values. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, I stood in Gerald's backyard looking at the lights twinkling across the neighborhood. A year ago, Dorothy had been gone for only a few months, and no one except her family knew the full story of what had been done to her. Her suffering had been private, her loss unmarked except by those who loved her. Now her name was known across the country. Her story had changed laws and ended careers and sparked a national conversation about HOA accountability. A tree grew in her memory. A law bore her name. And a community that had been poisoned by fear and pettiness was healing, learning to be the kind of neighborhood she had always wanted to live in. I thought about Patricia Hendricks, spending Christmas in a prison cell, her power and prestige stripped away by the same documentation practices she had insisted upon. There was no satisfaction in her imprisonment, only a sense that justice had been served. She had hurt people, stolen from them, abused the trust they had placed in her, and now she was facing consequences. It was appropriate, necessary, but not something to celebrate. The real victory was not Patricia's downfall, but the systemic changes that had occurred. The laws that would prevent future Patricias from destroying future Dorothys. The journalists who were now watching HOAs more carefully. The homeowners who understood their rights and were not afraid to assert them. The prosecutors who took elder abuse seriously, even when it was committed by respectable-seeming volunteers rather than obvious criminals. In January, I received a letter from the Arizona Attorney General's office. They were expanding their investigation into HOA practices statewide and wanted to know if I would be willing to serve on an advisory committee. I agreed. It felt like a natural extension of everything that had happened, another way to ensure that Dorothy's story continued to matter. The committee met monthly, reviewing complaints, recommending policy changes, and advising on enforcement priorities. I was the only non-lawyer on the committee, there to provide the homeowner perspective. I took the role seriously, reading every agenda packet, attending every meeting, and speaking up when I saw patterns that concerned me. Through this work, I learned just how widespread HOA problems were. In Arizona alone, there were over 7,000 HOAs governing more than 2 million residents. The vast majority were well managed and caused no problems. But even if only 1% were abusive, that meant 70 HOAs potentially harming thousands of homeowners. And the evidence suggested the problem was larger than 1%. We developed a rating system for HOAs, similar to restaurant health grades, based on transparency, complaint history, and governance practices. HOAs that met high standards received a ratings. Those with problems received lower grades. The ratings were published online, giving prospective homebuyers information about HOA quality before purchasing property. It was a small step, but it created incentives for better governance. Dorothy's law, which had passed the previous year, was working. Foreclosure rates by HOAs dropped significantly. More disputes were being resolved through mediation. The mandatory hardship consideration requirements meant that homeowners facing financial difficulties had to be offered reasonable payment plans. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Rachel came back to Arizona in February to do a follow-up story on the one-year anniversary of Patricia's conviction. She interviewed me, Karen, Gerald, and several other homeowners about how life had changed. The resulting article was hopeful but realistic, acknowledging that HOA reform was an ongoing process requiring continued vigilance. "What happened in Saguaro Springs was extraordinary," Rachel wrote. "But it should not have taken a widow's death and a criminal prosecution to spark reform. The question now is whether we can sustain the momentum and ensure that HOAs across the country operate with transparency, accountability, and basic human decency." In March, on the anniversary of Patricia's sentencing, I visited the desert willow tree again. It was covered in purple blooms, more spectacular than the previous year. A family was having a picnic nearby, their children running and laughing. They had probably moved to the neighborhood recently, after all the drama had settled. They would never know Patricia Hendricks or understand how different things had been just 2 years earlier. That was okay. The point was not to dwell on the past, but to build a better future. Dorothy's tree would grow for decades, long after everyone who remembered her personally was gone. But the shade it provided and the beauty it offered would continue. A living legacy of a woman who deserved better than she got, but whose suffering had not been meaningless. I placed my hand on the trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath my palm. "We are doing our best," I said quietly, not sure if I was talking to Dorothy or to myself. "Things are better. Not perfect, but better. And we are going to keep working to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else." The wind rustled through the branches, scattering purple petals across the grass. In the distance, I could hear children playing and neighbors calling greetings to each other. Saguaro Springs was becoming what it should have been all along. A community where people looked out for each other instead of looking for violations to report. I walked home as the sun set, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and pink. My house, Dorothy's house, stood solid and welcoming. Inside, I had the folder of meeting minutes, preserved as a reminder of why documentation matters, and why speaking up matters, and why ordinary people must hold power accountable. The story that began with a dusty folder behind a water heater had become something much larger. It had exposed corruption, changed laws, and reminded people that justice was possible even against entrenched institutions. Most importantly, it had given meaning to Dorothy's suffering and ensured she would not be forgotten. As I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, I felt grateful for the chain of coincidences and choices that had led me to this moment. Grateful that Dorothy had kept those records. Grateful that her family had not cleared them out. Grateful that I had been curious enough to look. And grateful for everyone who had helped turn those dusty papers into accountability and change. The lights of the neighborhood flickered on one by one as darkness fell. Somewhere in some other community, another HOA board was probably meeting, making decisions that would affect their neighbors' lives. I hoped they were making good decisions, acting with compassion and common sense. But if they were not, I hoped someone would be paying attention, documenting what happened and willing to speak up when necessary. Because that, ultimately, was the lesson of Dorothy's story. Evil flourishes not just because bad people do bad things, but because good people look away or assume someone else will handle it or convince themselves that nothing can be done. Dorothy had been failed by neighbors who knew something was wrong but did not act until it was too late. I had found her story by accident, but I had chosen to do something with it. And that choice had made all the difference. The house settled around me, creaking gently as the desert night cooled. I thought about all the evenings Dorothy must have spent here, all the meals shared with her husband, all the quiet moments of an ordinary life. She deserved to have finished her days in this peace. Instead, she had faced stress and fear and the betrayal of people who should have been her neighbors and protectors. But her story had not ended with her death. It had continued, growing and spreading, touching lives she never knew and preventing suffering she would never witness. In that way, she had achieved a kind of immortality. Not the kind anyone would choose, but a powerful legacy nonetheless. I made myself dinner and ate while reading emails from other homeowners seeking advice about their HOA problems. Some were manageable disputes that could probably be resolved with communication. Others showed troubling patterns of abuse that might require legal intervention. I responded to each one, offering what guidance I could and connecting people with resources. This had become my unexpected calling. I had moved to Scottsdale for a job and a fresh start. I had bought a house without knowing its history, and I had stumbled into a role as an advocate for HOA reform and homeowner rights. Life was strange sometimes, taking you places you never anticipated through paths you never would have chosen. But I would not change it. Finding those meeting minutes had been the most important accident of my life. Dorothy Clarkson had been a stranger whose name I learned only after her death. Yet she had become central to my understanding of justice, accountability, and the responsibility we all share to protect the vulnerable from abuse. Her story was my story now too. And I would carry it forward, telling it whenever necessary, using it to push for continued reforms and greater protections. Because Dorothy could not speak for herself anymore, but her words, preserved in meeting minutes and highlighted in yellow marker, could still change the world. The folder sat in its fireproof box, a testament to one woman's suffering and the movement it had sparked. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, a willow tree grew taller, its roots deepening, its branches spreading, a living monument to Dorothy Clarkson and all the homeowners who had faced injustice at the hands of those who were supposed to serve them. Justice had been achieved, reforms had been implemented, and a community had been transformed. But the work was not done and never would be. As long as HOAs existed, vigilance would be required. As long as people held power over their neighbors, accountability would be necessary. And as long as vulnerable people faced exploitation, someone would need to speak up. I was grateful to be one of those voices, grateful to have known Dorothy's story even though I never knew Dorothy. Grateful that a dusty folder and a moment of curiosity had led to something meaningful. Outside, the desert night deepened, stars emerging in brilliant profusion across the dark sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to push for change. But tonight, I simply sat in Dorothy's house, in my house, feeling connected to something larger than myself and honored to play a small part in ensuring that her suffering had not been in vain. Her memory lived on in the tree, in the law that bore her name, in the reforms that protected others, and in the determination of everyone who had been touched by her story to never let such injustice happen again. That was enough. It had to be enough. And it was worth every difficult moment of the journey from that Saturday afternoon in my garage to this quiet evening of reflection and resolve. Dorothy Clarkson's story was complete, but its impact would continue echoing through time, changing lives and systems and communities in ways both large and small. And that, in the end, was the most fitting memorial of all.